How does language affect the brain? Let's take a look at the different parts of the brain and how they affect sign and spoken language. Broca's area is located in the left frontal lobe of the brain. This was discovered by French surgeon Paul Broca in 1861 when working with patients that had lesions resulting in an inability to speak. From the study of these lesions, he understood that this area of the brain is responsible for the generation of language. The patient born came to Broca being only able to say 10. The lesion on his brain led to what is known as expressive aphasia or Broca's aphasia, characterized by partial loss of the ability to produce language, either spoken, manual, or written, even though comprehension remains intact. Larynx area is the region of the brain that is important for language development. It is located in the temporal lobe of the left side of the brain and is responsible for the comprehension of speech. A lesion in this area would result in larynx aphasia, affecting the ability to comprehend and produce both spoken and written communication. The primary auditory cortex processes auditory information as part of the sensory system for hearing, identifying pitch and loudness of sound. There is significant overlap between the brain and the areas used between sign language and spoken language. It can be concluded that these areas of the brain don't distinguish between language and communication coming to the ears or to the eyes. The main difference is that deaf people use parts of the brain that process visual motion. The cat sat on the bed. Mnemonics simplify learning process since there is a clear association between the word and what is experienced. Here in the image, you can see the difference between the brain of a deaf signer and the hearing speaker. The difference is not much more than the activation in the left hemisphere. For around 90% of people, language is represented in the left hemisphere. The language demonstrates how the same areas of the brain used to produce and understand spoken language are activated when using sign language. The auditory cortex changes its role. It becomes involved in working memory, helping us with cognitive tasks like problem solving and decision making, showing that regions of the brain can change from the usual role of processing sounds to a new role of storing and updating information.
Sign language has the same level of complexity and expressiveness as spoken languages. Since both spoken and sign language are processed by cognitive and related brain networks, it can be acquired as a native language in the same developmental stages as the ones we face with spoken languages. Since there is such a large amount of overlap between the regions in the brain being used while processing signed or spoken language, scientists have deduced that the linguistic computations in those regions of the brain are the same. The earlier one is exposed to a language, the easier language acquisition is, whether it is a native or non-native language. This early exposure will also make cognitive development such as functioning skills much easier. Functioning skills are a very important aspect of cognitive development, since they guide both our behavior and our learning. Inhibition, working memory, self-regulation, emotional control, and planning and organization are all examples of functioning skills that could come much easier to us if we are exposed to a language early on. All these skills contribute to a child's emotional, social, and even academic development. So, exposure to sign language can greatly aid and support these cognitive skills and abilities. This may be a bit surprising, but babies are actually extremely good when it comes to learning sign language. Sign language can be learned earlier if applied to babies rather than the use of spoken language, since it does not rely on the ability to speak or on pronunciation. As mentioned before, early language acquisition aids significantly in performance of cognitive tasks and abilities. More significantly, the tasks that deal with spatial reasoning. This is due to the fact that in sign language, rather than using terms such as in or left, signing spaces are used to represent iconically all spatial relations. For both deaf and hearing children who have parents that sign, learning sign language begins at birth. From the ages of 6 months, children who learn sign language begin to babble. Babbling means that they make sign-like actions on their hands, imitating the sign language they see around them. At age 1, children make their first sign around the same age that hearing children say their first word. Interestingly, children who sign also make the same type of errors in their production of those signs as hearing children when learning to speak who pronounce words incorrectly. By age 2, the child's vocabulary grows quickly, obtaining more complicated grammar, negating sentences, forming questions, and make use of the space in their signing.
American Sign Language. American Sign Language originated in the early 19th century in the American School for the Deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut. ASL is its own language and is separate from the English language. Just like spoken English, ASL has different regional dialects and slang, and they also have their own grammar. For example, one of the grammar rules in ASL is that a well-formed question must have the right kind of eyebrow positioning. Eyebrows should be down for a who, what, where, when, or why question, and up for a yes or no question. If you use the rules wrong or inconsistently, it will be as if you have a foreign accent. ASL is largely based on French Sign Language. There is about 250 to 500,000 people in the United States who claim ASL as their native language. ASL is not used just in the United States, but also in Canada, parts of West Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia. In many communities around the world, while there may not be official sign languages, there are codes for spoken and written languages. For example, cued speech is a visual communication system that was developed in the 1960s and uses 8 hand shapes in 4 different placements near the face in combination with mouth movements in order to represent phonetic signs rather than words and concepts. Another interesting thing that many people don't know is that sign language does not actually represent any spoken language. For example, American Sign Language is very different from British Sign Language, even though English is the spoken language in both countries. Even the basic grammar and spelling rules are different. Some more about sign languages around the world. French Sign Language is one of the earliest types of sign languages to be discovered. It was developed in the 18th century and allowed individuals to spell out words with a manual alphabet as well as expressing concepts with specific hand and arm movements. In France, students were discouraged to use sign language in schools from the late 1800s until the 1970s, and then it was incorporated again into education only in 1991. British Sign Language was developed in the late 1700s, and from there it spread to Australia and New Zealand, which is why their sign languages are quite similar and uses a lot of the same vocabulary and the same alphabet. In Nicaragua, the first school for the deaf opened in 1980. Students who were previously isolated from other deaf people brought in signs that they used at home, and then created a sort of basic means of communication between them, which was adopted by other students and eventually became a full linguistic system. In Ireland, many of the deaf students were educated in private Catholic schools which separated students by gender, so for a long time, men and women in Ireland each had their own different dialects of Irish Sign Language. It is estimated that between 1 million and 20 million people in China use Chinese Sign Language. It is difficult to determine how many people actually use it because the Chinese education system has been discouraging the use of sign languages for the past 50 years. Most people are taught using a strict oralist approach.
Now let's talk a little bit about the deaf community and deaf culture. In general, when we think of culture, it encompasses language, values, traditions, norms, and identity, and deaf culture is no exception to that. Deaf culture is at the base of the whole deaf community, so it encompasses history, achievements, and the contributions of the community to both themselves and the hearing society. And it's based on language, in this case, sign language, which has its own syntax, semantics, and social rules of use. One of the most important things to the deaf community is that society shouldn't view deafness as a deficiency, but rather as a completely separate linguistic context, worldview, and culture that is intertwined and interconnected all around the world. The deaf community encompasses all culturally deaf people, which might at times be hearing members, such as the family or friends of a deaf member. And it is the community that is in charge of perpetuating deaf culture through the arts from generation to generation. Now we'll go over some interesting facts about the deaf community. As mentioned before, deafness shouldn't be viewed as a disability. Therefore, deafness with a capital D represents a completely different human experience, one that should be lived through visual inputs rather than auditory. The deaf community is extremely interconnected and collectivist, and it places great value on two things: information sharing and clarity. So it is not surprising that sometimes deaf interactions might sound blunt or very straightforward to a member of the hearing community. On a similar note, a member of the deaf community wouldn't have any issue commenting on things that to a hearing person might seem rude or inappropriate, such as someone's weight or someone's looks. On the contrary, not mentioning very obvious things might make you seem uninterested or aloof. It's very important to remember that facial expressions are at the very base of all sign language communication, and that a deaf person's eye and hand are his communication means, so we have to try to not impair those during conversation. When non-native members enter the deaf community, they will have to spell out their names to introduce themselves up until the point where a member decides to gift them a name sign, which takes time and consideration as it has to apply to a complex system of rules and it has to be indicative of the person that it's being given to. Our first idiom will be the clearest one because it's the equivalent of our "what's up." "What's up" can be used as an informal conversation starter. So you might run into a friend at school and say, true business would be the equivalent of, "oh yeah, 100%, or "totally." A friend of yours might say, "did you see how hot that guy was that just walked by?" And you would reply to them with, the English equivalent for this could be either ew or barf. Let's say you're at work and a notoriously rude customer walks in. You turn to your coworker and you sign, this could be the English equivalent of "I don't care" or "screw it" or "F it." Let's say you're at a bar with a mate and it's getting late, so he suggests you stop drinking because you guys have class tomorrow. You can always turn around and say,
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.